And although it's probably tempting to lash out and maybe set them straight or attack their perspective, we really need to stop and ask ourselves one simple, important question. Will a reaction of retaliation, any of these things I just listed, will that be helpful to escape the escalation, or will it feed the escalation and the conflict? Welcome to the Blended Family Coaching Show, where you'll discover how to move your stepfamily from just surviving to truly thriving.
Grab your headphones and listen in as we share practical, real-life strategies for building healthy bonds,
Understanding the kids' perspective,
romance and partnership,
parenting with great teamwork.
and yes, even co-parenting with a difficult ex.
We're Mike and Kim Anderson, and we believe with the right tools, every step couple can overcome the common challenges of stepfamily life.
Join us for authentic and sometimes comical conversations to discover how you can lead your family with confidence and create the future you really want.
Well, hey everyone, welcome to episode 113. Wow, we just keep racking them up even after we took a whole month off last month, right? Hey, speaking of last month, we got a great review over on Apple Podcasts from Hannah, and we just want to say thank you. Hannah mentioned in her review that stumbling upon this podcast nearly 2 years ago was one of the best things that happened to us, meaning her and her husband, and I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
And she said, I highly recommend it to anyone in any sort of blended family. You say, thank you, Mike and Kim. Hannah, we say thank you so much for your feedback and for your connection with us. We so appreciate it. And if you want to take the cue from Hannah, you can hop over into Apple Podcasts and you can subscribe. You can leave a rating, like a star rating. You can leave a review for us. If you listen over on Spotify, you can follow us so that you don't miss anything. And that's really important right now because just this past Friday was our first simple step that launched, and you don't want to miss any of those. And here on the podcast, if you subscribe and if you follow, that's like the only place to get them. Yeah. So make sure you don't miss out on that. Well, hey, enough of me blathering on with all this. Why don't we actually get started on our episode today?
Yes. All right. So last week we shared some of the most difficult dynamics between former spouses when it comes to co-parenting.
Yep.
And we call these the dangerous Ds because if they aren't handled with care, they can lead to escalated conflict, which erodes co-parenting collaboration. And when that happens, it eventually leads to painful and unhealthy things for the kids.
That's right.
It doesn't protect their well-being when we're there.
Yep.
And that is one of the overarching goals of this discussion, to help you safeguard your kids and keep them from being put in the middle of parenting issues that should be handled by the adults.
Right.
So simply put, you want to do everything you can do to work as cooperative colleagues with your former spouse and avoid the danger zone of becoming angry associates or fiery foes.
Right.
And that's what we're going to help you with today. Now, I just threw some terms out there that maybe don't sound familiar to you.
Sure, that's right. Yeah.
And if that's the case, then you may have missed last week's episode, episode 112. And if that's you, then we encourage you to go back and listen to that episode first. And then today's discussion will make a whole lot more sense.
That's right. Because today we're going to offer some healthy mindsets and practical tools that'll help you to stay focused on keeping your co-parenting partnership in the cooperative colleague arena and escape some escalation, maintain some security, respond appropriately, and then take wise action steps, even if you're struggling with some tough emotions and feeling devalued, disregarded, or dismissed by your former spouse. Yeah. And here's the deal. These dynamics are hard.
Oh, yeah.
Responding well in these emotionally charged situations isn't always going to be easy. But you've got what it takes to take the high road and stay focused on the well-being of your kids. So we encourage you to let your kids be your motivation for listening to this episode with an open mind. And we're going to challenge you to maintain a willing attitude around how you might respond in some healthy ways when you and your former spouse are really struggling.
And we've had to learn how to do this well when I experienced all three of the dangerous D's from my former spouse, and we've helped many blended family couples navigate these really challenging dynamics.
Sure, that's right.
All right. So first, let's quickly refresh your memory from last week's episode because we're going to pick up where we left off with Dwayne. Now, if you'll remember, he was in the middle of a struggle with his former spouse, Katie.
Not their real names,
yes,
of course.
Again, not their real names. Now, Dwayne had suggested getting some help for their daughter, Molly, around some social anxiety she had been struggling with. And Katie quickly dismissed Dwayne's perspective. Now, you might recall that these two former spouses had been pretty cooperative for many years following their divorce, but things were starting to shift a bit as their two girls became teenagers.
Yep.
Their daughter, Molly, is now hoping to be able to get a part-time job and earn a little bit of money on her own, but she's worried about how she'll manage a job if she experiences anxiety. So Dwayne and Rachel, his current spouse, they want to support and help Molly to reach her goals. And so they found a coach for adolescents who specializes in anxiety. But when Dwayne approached his former spouse, Katie, with the idea of getting Molly some focused help for her anxiety, Katie disagreed. And she was adamant that Molly would not be doing any coaching or counseling.
No way, no how.
Katie also speculated that if Dwayne moved forward to get their daughter into coaching, Molly would feel judged, unaccepted, and abandoned by him. That's where we were at.
Right. So when Dwayne and Rachel reached out to us for help, they were feeling pretty frustrated.
Yeah.
They were trying to advocate for Molly. Their motives were really good and loving, and they wanted her to have the ability to reach her goals. And because of anxiety, it held Molly back in a variety of ways over the years. Their concerns around her future were pretty valid. They didn't want anxiety to keep her from being successful in life. But Dwayne felt that Katie had dismissed his perspective altogether. And then her negative comments around how she believed Molly would respond to him made him wonder if his good intentions would lead to something negative in his relationship with his daughter. He was confused, and he was pretty unsure where to go from there.
Yeah. Okay, so lots of tough emotions there, right? There's pain, there's stress, there was some shock and some anger.
Yeah.
And there's some second guessing and doubt happening for Dwayne as well. Now, last week we talked about some unproductive ways that any dismissed parent might react in this kind of situation, and how a hasty reaction could negatively impact your co-parenting relationship and the kids as well.
Yeah, last week was kind of the don't do this week.
Right.
Now we'll get into some do's.
Some positives, some things we can do.
Yeah.
So we know what not to do in these dynamics, what really isn't helpful, but let's talk about healthy ways to respond when we're feeling dismissed or one of the other two dangerous D's, which are devalued or disregarded. That's today's focus.
That's right. When you find yourself feeling that strong emotion that pops up when you're on the receiving end of one of the dangerous D's, you're going to want to remember this little phrase to start out with. Escape the escalation.
Oh, yeah.
Now, escaping the escalation takes some self-control, because your gut reaction might be to fight back when your former spouse is dismissing, devaluing, or disregarding you. Like a lot of us have that reaction, right? And fighting back can take a lot of different forms, but usually we revert to some old habits of warfare that may have been going on really for years, maybe even before the separation or divorce.
Right.
Maybe you tend to get critical or defensive or demanding. Some people use sarcasm or contempt when they feel that they aren't being treated right. Others dredge up the past for ammunition, or maybe start to nitpick all the little tiny things. Or maybe you're a stonewaller and you give that former spouse the silent treatment as a form of punishment. Most of us can get pretty aware of what buttons we get to push to hurt or to shut down that former spouse, right? We remember them, and so we try to use them. And although it's probably tempting to lash out and maybe set them straight or attack their perspective, we really need to stop and ask ourselves one simple, important question. Will a reaction of retaliation, any of these things I just listed, will that be helpful to escape the escalation, or will it feed the escalation and the conflict?
Well, chances are you've been in conflict with your former spouse before.
Maybe a couple times. Yeah.
It might even be one of the main reasons you divorced because you weren't able to communicate effectively, and the two of you got stuck in these unproductive cycles of conflict and mudslinging. And so you already know the outcome, right? A reaction of retaliation is going to feed the escalation and feed the conflict.
Yep.
As a result, you'll probably end up in the danger zone that move you toward the angry associate or the fiery foes.
That's right.
Unless you choose to do something different.
Yep.
And this is a choice. Everyone can do something different here. It might feel really good. It might even feel right in the moment to just let loose with your anger and attack against your former spouse when you're feeling dismissed, devalued, or disregarded. But it's going to make things worse in the long run.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Yeah. So the question is, well, what can we do differently to escape the escalation? Well, one thing we encouraged Dwayne to do before he reacted back to Katie's email was to stay focused on the facts. Yes, his emotions were charged. He was worked up. He was upset in that moment. But his negative emotions weren't going to help him work through the actual issue itself. So we allowed Dwayne to express his emotions, and we validated how difficult this situation is. You know, it's okay to name and to talk about how you feel without acting out emotionally.
Absolutely.
Right? We all need to do that at times. And once Dwayne was able to express how he was feeling, and we were able to simply affirm and validate those feelings, he was actually a lot calmer. And then he got to refocus his energy back where it needed to be, on the welfare of his daughter.
Exactly.
Like, let's figure out the issue instead of get caught in all these negative emotions.
Yeah. I mean, what this really means is that in that emotionally charged state, when you're tempted to take the bait and react, you need to stop. Process your emotions with a trusted person and allow yourself some time to calm down before you move forward in communicating with your former spouse. The minute you take the bait and react in a negative way, you've fed into the escalation, and now you're focused more on retaliating against your former spouse than safeguarding your kids. Don't take the bait. I know it's hard, but don't do it. Choose to escape the escalation instead. Then you can avoid those danger zones that we want to stay away from.
That's right. And, you know, in Dwayne's situation, we talked a lot about how this was an email exchange. Sometimes they're right in front of you. And so there are times when you know that you're about to retaliate where you might have to say something simple like, hey, I've heard what you had to say, and I need a little bit to process that. I'll call you back, or I'll talk to you tomorrow, or I'll shoot you an email pretty soon. And give yourself an out to get out of that conversation so that you can actually do the processing that you need to do. And I just want to clarify something. You know, when Kim's talking about processing your emotions with a trusted person, we want to recommend that you find someone who has the ability to listen objectively without feeding the fire.
Oh, yeah.
Now, we never said to Dwayne in the middle of his dilemma here, you know what, Katie is really out of line, and you've got a right to do whatever you want. Molly's your daughter, and Katie's just going to have to deal with it.
No.
Like we never went down any road like that, right? You don't want to process with someone who responds in a way like that. That just is going to create more of an oppositional mindset rather than a cooperative one.
Right.
And I hate to say it, but sometimes your current spouse might not even be the person to process these tough things with, because this stuff can kind of get, you know, out of hand. And sometimes those current spouses can get really worked up, or they can tend to become protective of you, and they want to lash out at your former spouse themselves.
Yeah.
So we've seen quite a few step-parents who kind of jump right into the middle of these dynamics with their spouse's former spouse, and sometimes they just stir up a lot of unnecessary drama.
Yeah, they can make it worse.
Yeah, so be really wise in how you go about processing these emotions and who you're processing it with. You want someone that can stay objective and listen more than they speak. Someone who can help you to regulate your emotions in a healthy way and stay focused on the facts, not feed your emotional fire. Now, if your current spouse does kind of feed that fire, you still need to be able to talk to them. We're not in any way suggesting that you hide your emotions or any of these challenges from them.
Right.
But getting on the same page with them is a topic really kind of, I guess, for another episode.
Yeah.
Or you might just reach out to us for a free coaching call, and we'll see how we might be able to support you with that. But just be wise in who you're talking to.
Definitely. Like we said, choosing to do something different to escape escalation will take self-control.
Yeah.
And those times when we tend to lash out, if we're really honest with ourselves, we probably recognize that we're somehow thinking we can change or control our former spouse, right?
What's wrong? We can't do that?
No. Underneath it all, we might be thinking, if I can criticize their perspective and tell them they're wrong, or defend my position so they see how right I am, everything's going to work out the way I want it to.
That might be a false expectation.
Yeah, this kind of thinking is really misguided. The reality is that you can't change anyone except yourself in this dynamic. And the truth is that when you react in a negative way towards your former spouse, they will likely do the same to you and probably dig their heels in even deeper or even use the kids to make their point, So what you think is going to fix the problem, changing their mind or controlling their decisions, is actually working against you because there typically are no easy fixes between former spouses.
Yeah.
Working through a disagreement and staying cooperative is going to take some intentional effort. And it begins with managing your own emotions so that you can escape the escalation. That's what you really do have control over, how you react in that emotionally charged moment. So don't take the bait.
Absolutely. Okay, so once you've had a chance to process what you're feeling, you've calmed down, and you're in a better state of mind, you can move on to the next step, which is to maintain your security. So Dwayne was really struggling with some self-doubt because of Katie's negative comments toward him that trying to get Molly some help with her anxiety would cause her to feel judged by him. So he was second-guessing his idea about getting Molly some help. And, sometimes it's really common for a former spouse to trigger this fear or guilt or insecurity in us, right? Especially in those moments where there's a lot of disagreement and stress.
Right.
So as we were processing this with Dwayne, we asked him to consider what he's noticed about interactions that he might have had directly with Molly around the subject of getting support for anxiety. So as Dwayne reflected on the conversations that he remembered, he came to realize that Molly actually willingly engaged and even seemed to feel supported by him, which was very different than what Katie had been insinuating about Molly feeling judged by him.
Right. We then asked Dwayne what his primary hope and motive was in wanting to get Molly help. He shared that he only wanted what was best for Molly and for her to be able to live her life with skills that would help her to manage her anxiety well, rather than having it control her. This helped Dwayne to move away from self-doubt and maintain his own security as a father. He recognized that his motives were good, and he did not believe that getting Molly this kind of help was going to negatively impact his relationship with her.
Yeah, that made a huge difference in his sense of security as her dad.
Right.
And, you can ask yourself these kinds of questions, too, when an interaction with your former spouse has left you doubting yourself. Maybe in that moment where you feel a little bit of fear or guilt, you can ask yourself if there's any truth to their perspective. In Dwayne's situation, it's true that his daughter could possibly have a negative response to getting help, especially if it was approached in a difficult way.
Right.
But Dwayne was confident that that wasn't the case based on his direct experience with his daughter. not only basing it on what Katie believed might happen, right? She was kind of speculating there. Sometimes former spouses project their own doubts and fears onto the situation, but these maybe are irrational sometimes or just a little misguided. So do your best to assess the situation from a rational place that's based on the facts of your own experience. This can help you to maintain your security as a parent and seek some ways to move forward toward a collaborative solution. It's okay that your former spouse has a different perspective than you. We're not suggesting that you're trying to change their perspective, right? We just talked about that. It's normal for them to have a different perspective. But if their perspective dismisses your good motives or doesn't paint an accurate picture, it's also okay for you to stand firm in your own truth.
Yeah.
So what you don't want to do is make decisions based on fear or guilt or someone else's misguided perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, when you ask yourself what your motives are, really in any difficult co-parenting situation, be totally honest with yourself. We discovered that Dwayne's motives were good, but we've worked with parents whose motives were not always so good. They were actually creating animosity in their co-parenting relationship, sometimes unintentionally.
Right.
You know, we're all susceptible to blind spots in our co-parenting relationship. There can be a lot of painful history and complicated emotions involved, which can taint the facts and get us off track. So get really honest with yourself. Are you playing the comparison game or competing with the other home? Have you dubbed your former spouse as the villain? If you're holding on to bitterness and distrust that's rooted in the past and your motive is to punish or get back at your former spouse, to knock them down or even to one-up them, to control, manipulate, or cause them discomfort, if that's the case, you need to stop and refocus your priorities.
That's right.
When your disagreements with your former spouse are more about them as opposed to what's best for the kids, you know you've gotten way off track.
Yeah, that's a good clue, right? Yeah.
Now, of course, we realize there are extreme situations where kids do need to be protected from things like abuse or neglect that might be going on in the other home. And that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about divorced parents raising kids in two homes, doing their best to make good parenting decisions. Neither parent is going to be perfect, and you can't expect to agree on everything, and that's okay. But you do need to figure out how to co-parent well for the sake of your kids, and that's
right.
what we're hoping you'll learn today. So let's move on.
All right. So you've been honest with yourself, and you're confident that your motives are good. Now it's time to decide what an appropriate response might look like. But before you do that, it can be really helpful to gain some empathy for your former spouse first. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
All right. I know you're probably thinking, wait, what? Did he seriously just say that? Empathize with my former spouse, the way they're acting? I know this can be a really challenging step in this whole process, but it's critical. And here's why. Because putting yourself into their shoes for just a moment and gaining a little understanding around why they might be reacting the way they are typically brings great insight into how you can best respond in a way that's most beneficial for your kids. You know, there are always two sides to every perspective, and I'm betting you want your perspective to be considered, right? So I'm going to challenge you to consider your former spouse's perspective as well. That's what we're talking about. That's empathy.
And challenging our coaching clients to do this empathy thing is not always their favorite process.
Probably not.
But it's such an important component of this. And that was not different in Dwayne's story. It was important for him. So we asked Dwayne what could be going on under the surface for Katie that could cause her to react the way she did. Could she be fearful about something? Maybe there's some insecurity that's surfaced or some guilt. Do you think she might feel threatened in some way or just really uncomfortable about something? Now, if you're challenging yourself to gain some empathy for your former spouse, you might realize that you're kind of speculating here, and that's okay. but do your best to explore different possibilities that might shed a little light on why your former spouse has reacted the way that they have.
That's right.
Now, Dwayne, he immediately recognized that, oh yeah, Katie, she struggles with anxiety herself, and she's often felt judged by others because of it over the years. She also feels like all the therapeutic measures that she's tried have not seemed to relieve her anxiety. She kind of has that mindset that nothing will work and anxiety is just something some people have to live with.
That's right.
So it could be that Katie feels hopeless for Molly and believes that coaching really won't bring her any value or help.
Yeah, and that's great insight. And it ultimately helped us to better understand Katie's possible perspective and shed a little light on how Dwayne might move forward with a better possible approach.
Right.
We want to make things easier for Katie, not harder.
Absolutely.
Right? And even though it's hard sometimes to have empathy for a former spouse that's causing us pain, this kind of understanding can help you become a better co-parent. If you can move your mindset from a place of demanding your way to a place of understanding all that might be going on in the bigger picture, your ability to respond in a way that promotes a cooperative colleague approach to co-parenting is greatly going to increase.
It will, yeah.
So even though it can be hard, do your best to put yourself in your former spouse's shoes and try to understand their perspective and build some empathy for just a few minutes before you start taking your next steps. Your empathy can help direct your action steps, and that can make a huge difference in how you're received. A demanding approach is going to elicit opposition, but an understanding approach is going to open the door to collaboration.
Okay, you've escaped the escalation and you're feeling more calm and secure.
Ooh, feeling good.
You've also checked to make sure your motives are good, and you've gained some empathy and some insight.
Nice.
Now it's time to brainstorm your possible next steps.
All right, my favorite.
Yep, you love this. So rather than reacting impulsively or doing something rash like we talked about last week, which will have a negative impact on your ability to cooperatively co-parent and will also negatively impact your kids, instead, the smart approach is to slow yourself down so that you can consider different approaches and ideas around how you might move forward. For a dismissed parent like Dwayne, he was able to explore different ideas around what he could do with or without Katie's approval to support Molly and help her reach her goals. As Dwayne brainstormed, he decided it made more sense to break down this big goal of resolving Molly's anxiety into smaller, more realistic goals, like helping her take small steps toward getting a job in the near future. He also explored ways that he could learn more about anxiety and come alongside Molly in a supportive role himself, and maybe even work directly with the anxiety coach to do that.
Yeah, and last week we talked about the 3 Ds. So let's talk about some ideas around the other 2 Ds as well. So that was dismissed, but for a disregarded parent, you might just ask yourself some things like, well, what are some possible ways to get pertinent information about the kids' activities without depending on my former spouse, right? This is a kind of a proactive approach. And you may recall last week we talked about this parent who was showing up to his son's baseball games and found out his former spouse was giving him the wrong times. Man, that's tough and that's hurtful. Well, we got to talk with him about, when he's feeling disregarded, instead of lashing out in a reactive way after he was given that incorrect start time, he considered how he might be more proactive, like asking his son's coach to add his contact information to the parent roster. So that way he got the appropriate information directly from the coach, and he was no longer dependent on his former spouse to transfer that information, right? That's just one simple little brainstorm idea. And it's something that's within your power to do that doesn't involve changing or controlling your former spouse, and it's appropriate within the co-parenting dynamic.
Absolutely.
So we're looking for those kind of simple ideas. What about the devalued parent?
Yeah. A devalued parent might want to consider reaching out for resources to do some research.
That's a great next step.
Yeah, high levels of consistent devaluing can lead to some very difficult situations that may even impact parental rights.
Mm-hmm.
We know how overwhelming this can be because we went through this when I was being devalued.
For sure.
But it's often helpful to define small, doable steps. Maybe start with simply reviewing your parenting plan to identify where there might be some deviation or possible gaps that need to be addressed. Maybe it's listening to a podcast episode for encouragement or doing some research or gaining knowledge. The book Divorce Poison by Dr. Warshak is a great resource for understanding parental alienation, you know, what it is and what it's not.
Yeah.
And it also offers practical ways to be proactive and protect your parental rights when you're being devalued.
Yeah. And if you're not familiar with this term parental alienation, you might need to get familiar with it. And I love the way you said, you know, Dr. Warshak helps us learn what it is and what it's not, because this whole thing, it's a form of extreme devaluing, and it is pretty extreme. I don't use that word lightly. It kind of invalidates that other parent, and it actually invalidates their rights. And boy, it can happen intentionally, and it's often systematic, and it distances the child from that other parent. That's what you experienced, honey.
Yeah, it was awful.
Annika. It was terrible. So if you want to understand more, we'll put a link in the notes to an episode about our challenging story around parental alienation, and that'll just help you gain some awareness and how you might respond with some simple action steps when you're feeling like maybe devaluing is getting out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Being devalued as a parent can be subtle at first, but it's quite insidious and it can quickly escalate. So actively gaining knowledge and safeguarding your relationship with your kids is really important.
Yeah.
And we'll put a link for the book Divorce Poison and also several episodes, the one Mike talked about and a few others around how to cope with a difficult or a toxic ex and protect your kids, as well as how to handle lies and slander that the kids might be hearing about you from your former spouse.
Yeah.
And we have plenty of experience with this.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. And honestly, I haven't always handled it well. And sometimes my reactivity made things worse.
Yeah.
But like I said, we've gone through the process of learning how to navigate these challenges well and responding better.
Yeah, we did get better toward the end, yeah.
And this can be a complicated issue that really needs to be handled with care, being devalued. If you feel you need some help brainstorming how to respond if you're being devalued or any other of these difficult situations with a former spouse, please reach out to us for some support.
For sure.
We'll put a link in the show notes if you'd like to schedule a free coaching session, and we'd love to support you in that way.
Absolutely. Don't suffer alone if you're in that more extreme situation. However, let's kind of get back on track. Today, we're talking about the typical challenges of co-parenting when you and your former spouse just don't see eye to eye. So you're ready to brainstorm, and in the process, you're going to want to get as creative as you can to explore some different ideas. And you might come up with at least 5 or maybe even 6 different ways that you think of to move forward. And then you can hone in on just one idea or maybe a combination of those ideas that you'd like to try. That's going to help you to begin the process of formulating some reasonable next steps. The ones that make the most sense in the situation and that are going to promote a cooperative co-parenting relationship. Remember, you want to keep your focus on what's best for the kids. Yeah.
Then, once you have a couple ideas on how to move forward, you'll likely need to communicate with your former spouse around the issue at hand, right?
Again, don't we?
Now, clear, concise, and professional communication is absolutely critical here because some of the biggest barriers to a cooperative relationship are poor communication, misunderstandings, and misguided assumptions.
Yep.
When communicating with your former spouse, don't leave room for any of these to take place.
Yeah.
And you can do this in a respectful way with a professional, courteous, and direct approach. If you're communicating in writing, use bullet points and stay focused on the facts and the well-being of the kids.
Yep.
Do your best to keep your emotions out of your communication And try to write your email with a little bit of lightheartedness if you can.
For sure.
Remember, the goal is not to change, control, or convince them of anything.
Yep.
The goal is to keep healthy communication open so that you can find a solution you can both live with.
Mm-hmm.
When you're communicating, choose to focus on a behavioral solution to the problem rather than staying stuck in the emotions of who's right or who's wrong.
Yeah, that's great. When we first talked with Dwayne around how he was going to communicate with Katie, he really wanted to kind of set her straight and explain why her perspective was wrong. He also wanted to correct her speculations around how Molly was going to react to getting help. But after Dwayne was able to process through his emotions, get to a calmer place, he realized that reacting with a hasty reply probably was just going to escalate the conflict.
Oh, yeah.
So instead, we helped Dwayne to think through what kind of information was most important and to stay focused on Molly's well-being and to find a positive approach in delivering what needed to be communicated at this moment in time. Dwayne also needed to keep his expectations realistic around how she might respond to that communication because there's no guarantees in this, right?
Yeah, and it's a process.
So when we helped Dwayne with this, we walked him through what we call the 4 A's that can be helpful in structuring a response to a former spouse. So you might consider trying these the next time you need to communicate with a former spouse as well. You can do this verbally or you can do it in an email or whatever it is if you just remember these 4 A's. The first A is affirm your former spouse in some way. Start with affirmation, even if all you're doing is simply affirming that their perspective has value. So it might sound something like this. If it was Dwayne, he might say something like, "Hi, Katie. Thanks for sharing your perspective. I can see this is important to you."
Exactly.
Notice he didn't agree to anything.
No.
He's just affirming that her perspective is important. And by the way, if you're writing this in an email, put hi before the name of your former spouse. If you just put their name, it's already starting out kind of curt. So affirm your former spouse in some way. Hey, thanks for sharing your perspective. I can see this is important to you.
And what I love about that is that he's not trying to attack her perspective or prove that she's wrong and he's right.
Right.
Because her perspective is important.
That's right.
There is no right and wrong here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
She wants to do good things for Molly as well.
Right. She loves her daughter just like he does. That's right. So affirm. The next day is acknowledge. And what you're acknowledging is simply the common ground. This can be summed up in a really simple statement like, I know we both want what's best for the kids.
Right.
Right. We're just acknowledging that there's common ground and we're not totally opposed to each other in this. Right. So affirm, acknowledge, and then assure cooperation. So again, a really simple sentence like, I'm sure we can collaborate to find a solution. Right. That simple little sentence communicates assurance that you want to work with your former spouse and not against them.
Keeps the door open.
That's right. And then finally, we want to ask for their partnership. Usually, we're trying to work toward a solution together. So there's typically going to be some kind of an ask, right? This is where you're going to take those ideas that you brainstormed and you want to communicate them in the simplest way possible. Small, actionable steps. And remember, you might only ask about 1 or 2 at a time. Even if in your brainstorming thing, you came up with 8 of the greatest ideas you could possibly think of, it might be best to just take small steps and stick to the first 1 or 2 for now. And you can follow up with the rest of those ideas later.
Yeah, and you want to stay focused on one situation at a time.
That's right. Don't overwhelm them. Yeah. In our story, Dwayne realized how hard this issue might really be for Katie because of her own struggle with anxiety. So he asked for her partnership by inquiring if she would consider simply meeting with the anxiety coach herself so that she could ask all the questions she wants and find out more about what's possible.
Right.
So in his communication with Katie, he also focused on the smaller goal of Molly being able to get a job and earn the money that she'd hoped to earn. These were so much smaller steps for Katie to wrap her head around than, hey, we need to do this big, long,
fix the anxiety
thing,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So his simple way to ask in this email was something like, hey, would you be willing to consider meeting with the coach? And what might a next step be in supporting Molly to get the job she wants?
Right.
I love that kind of question because you're still staying focused on what you're after, that helping her get that job, but you're actually inviting the former spouse to talk about what a next step might be from their perspective.
Right. They might have some good brainstorming
Who
ideas.
Who knows? Yeah, that you never know what you'll find out if you can keep it short and sweet and professional, but also just simple.
Because you're moving away from opposition.
Yeah, exactly. So in his communication, Dwayne didn't share the intense emotions that he'd experienced when Katie dismissed his perspective, right? He didn't take a defensive stance. He resisted the urge to blame or control or get critical. Dwayne chose to communicate in a respectful way. He was courteous, professional, and direct. He also stayed focused on the good things that he wanted for Molly, and he conveyed hope that he and Katie would be able to work together on their daughter's behalf. So hopefully that's helpful for you, these 4 A's. It's affirm, acknowledge, assure, and ask. And you might need to hit pause and back up about a minute and a half and get your notepad out and write those down, but that can be really helpful. And you know what? In all of this, what I don't want you to think is this is like the silver bullet or the formula. Because the truth is there's no guarantees around this. You can't change your ex's character, and you don't have control over how they show up when the two of you are interacting. However, your best chance to build a cooperative relationship is to focus on influencing your former spouse's behavior over time by consistently showing up differently yourself.
Absolutely.
You may have quite a few more years in this whole co-parenting journey ahead of you. And wouldn't it be great if you could improve your interactions? The reality is how you choose to treat them, even when they're lashing out at you. I might say, especially when they're lashing out at you, can make all the difference. Think about it. It won't be quite as satisfying for them to retaliate and oppose you if you're responding in a calm and respectful way. If you choose not to take the bait, it's just no fun to pick on someone who just doesn't take that bait,
who chooses not to go there.
That's right. When they realize that you're no longer going to engage in unproductive, hurtful communication, they might just decide it's not worth it anymore to continue that behavior either. So don't give up on this. Keep showing up. Keep doing the right thing.
Right. Consistency is important. And one of the hardest things to do when you're experiencing a difficult co-parenting relationship is to practice the golden rule.
I love the golden rule when it goes in my favor.
It's all about treating them the way you would like to be treated. But this strategy can really help because really, you cannot expect your former spouse to change their behavior and treat you better if you continue to treat them badly.
That's right.
Things will just continue on a downward spiral.
And, it seems so simple and almost too simplistic, but the golden rule is actually a really powerful strategy for co-parents that we actually did a whole episode on that was step-by-step direction on how to live this out. It's back in episode 67. It's called The Best Co-Parenting Strategy That You Already Know, right? It's the golden rule. So we'll put a link in the show notes for you, and maybe you can go back and listen to that episode and just gain a few other insights and skills that can really make a difference.
So we recently checked in with Dwayne and his current wife, Rachel, to see how things had been going since our last coaching session. And Dwayne shared that his direct and respectful communication was well received by Katie. But at this point, she isn't interested in meeting with the anxiety coach. However, Katie has moved forward and enrolled Molly in some activities that encourage interaction with others rather than spending so much time in isolation. And that's a win, right? That's a great step forward.
For sure.
So although Katie hasn't accepted Dwayne's idea around coaching, she has not dismissed his concerns around Molly's development and goals for her future.
That's great. So he didn't get everything he wanted, but they're taking some steps forward.
They're moving in the right direction.
That's awesome.
Katie's doing what she's comfortable with now, which is
a great step.
It is. Yeah. It really is. And maybe if things go well, she'll reconsider Dwayne's idea around getting Molly into coaching. Down the road, who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
So things are hopeful and moving in a positive direction. Their co-parenting has been collaborative, and they're finding ways to work together around Molly's well-being.
I love it. You know, Dwayne also shared that he's reading a parenting book himself about how to help a child cope with anxiety, and he's planning to just start working directly with Molly to try out some of the things that he's learning. What an awesome possible solution, right? He's also considered meeting with that anxiety coach himself to get his own coaching around how he might be able to help Molly best. Awesome.
That's one of the things that came out in our brainstorming, and he's moving forward with it.
Well done, Dwayne.
Yes.
And I know Dwayne's not your real name, but you know who you are.
Yes. Well done. So originally, Dwayne felt dismissed by Katie, and he was hurt and confused because he'd bought into some of her misguided beliefs about the situation.
For a bit, yep.
But as we used these steps to coach him through it, he was able to move away from the danger zone. First, we helped him to escape escalation. We encouraged him to focus on the facts and the things he did have control over.
That's right. Then we affirmed his difficult emotions while remaining objective. He needed to feel heard. He needed to feel known. And it was just helpful for him to process through that. Then we helped him to emotionally regulate by focusing on the truth, that's his truth, and letting go of Katie's negative opinions and projections about the situation.
Yeah. After that, we asked what might be going on with Katie under the surface. This helped Dwayne to build empathy and understanding around where her resistance could be coming from and how to best approach her in this situation.
And next, we started the process of brainstorming with Dwayne around some next steps. And remember, it can be helpful to challenge yourself to come up with 5 or 6 ideas rather than just going with the first thing that you think of.
Right. Get creative.
That's absolutely right. We also strategized around how Dwayne might communicate with Katie and encouraged him to be direct and respectful.
Right. We use the 4 A's.
Absolutely. So if you find yourself in the danger zone with your former spouse, we know it's not easy, but we encourage you to approach your disagreements and interactions thoughtfully. It's tempting to rush in and just react by trying to control or unleashing your own anger or retaliating and sometimes even resorting to punishing or paying them back. But this is just unwise in the grand scheme of things. And ultimately, it doesn't help your kids. It's our challenge to you to slow yourself down and intentionally follow some of the steps that we've outlined in this episode to the best of your ability. Now, you're probably going to need to adjust or tweak them a bit in order to fit your specific dynamics or this current challenge. And if you need some help with that, please reach out to us. Schedule a free coaching call. We'd really love to support you.
Yeah. Now, if you're still struggling with this and you just aren't sure you even want to put in the effort to try anything new in your co-parenting relationship,
I get that.
Yeah, we totally get it. This is not easy. But we're going to leave you with some powerful motivation.
All right, bring it on.
Research has revealed that high conflict stepfamilies and conflict between their parents can have negative effects on children and can be contributing factors in their overall adjustment and development. Children are less likely to complete high school and are more likely to have lower educational achievement and leave home earlier. Now, that might be hard for you to hear. It's pretty bleak. But here's the good news. Research also clearly confirms that children successfully adjust to the ending of their parents' marriage and can fare reasonably well if the following circumstances exist.
All right, so they can do good if these things happen.
Yep. First, parents are able to bring their marital relationship to a close without excessive conflict.
Peace, peace, peace.
Second, children are not put into the middle of whatever conflict does still exist. And third, there's a commitment from both parents to cooperate, on issues of the children's material, physical, spiritual, educational, and emotional welfare.
Yeah.
The bottom line is that children need their parents to work together,
Yeah.
whether they're married, divorced, or remarried.
That's right.
And you're a positive example to your kids when you're able to respond appropriately to difficult situations and disagreement.
That's so good. Yeah. Regardless of how your former spouse behaves, you are responsible for your behavior and how you're going to show up in your co-parenting relationship. And you can choose to respond wisely and work toward building a cooperative relationship. And ultimately, it's what your kids really need you to do. Yeah. So hopefully that motivates you to try something new and steer clear of those danger zones, even when that former spouse isn't showing up very well themselves.
You can do it.
All right. So next week, we're going to be chatting about some easy comparison traps that we sometimes fall into in a blended family life. And you know what? Some of these comparison traps have to do with that other home, that former spouse. But there's some that don't as well.
There's quite a few.
So we want to make sure that you join us back here next week. But that makes this episode a wrap.
Until next time.